March 5th, 1943. The air inside the 2nd Corps headquarters in Tunisia was thick with tension, a suffocating atmosphere that had nothing to do with the North African heat and everything to do with the impending execution of a military career. Major General Lloyd Fredendall stood across from Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. The meeting was brief, brutal, and devoid of the camaraderie that usually exists between high-ranking officers. Eisenhower had flown into the dusty theater of war personally, not to consult, but to deliver a verdict. The news was a guillotine blade, dropping on Fredendall's professional life. He was relieved of command, effective immediately. There would be no appeals, no second chances, and no face-saving transfer to a lateral position within the combat zone. His replacement, the flamboyant and aggressive Major General George S. Patton, Jr., was already en route and would assume control the very next day. Fredendall was ordered to pack his bags, return to Algiers, and then proceed directly to Washington. The order was verbal, delivered with a cold, steely professionalism that masked Eisenhower's simmering fury. Eisenhower didn't need to articulate the why. The reasons were written in the blood of American soldiers soaking into the Tunisian sand. 2 weeks earlier, Fredendall's 2nd Corps had been utterly shattered at the Battle of Kasserine Pass. It was the first major clash between American forces and the German Wehrmacht, and it had resulted in the worst American defeat of the North African campaign. Thousands of American casualties had been inflicted in a matter of days. Entire units, terrified and leaderless, had routed in panic, abandoning their equipment and their dignity. For those 2 intervening weeks, Fredendall had sat in his headquarters, isolated and defensive, spending his energy blaming everyone except himself. He claimed his subordinate commanders were incompetent. He argued the intelligence reports were inadequate. He insisted the troops were green, untrained, and prone to panic under fire. He constructed a fortress of excuses to protect his reputation, but Eisenhower's decision made it crystal clear what he thought of those explanations. As Fredendall packed his belongings, stripping his personal items from the desk he had commanded from, he believed his career was over. He saw the looming specter of disgrace, but he had no idea what was truly coming. To understand the magnitude of this dismissal, we must rewind to the catastrophe itself. February 14th, 1943, Valentine's Day. But there was no love lost in the desolate passes of central Tunisia. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, launched a ferocious attack through Kasserine Pass. His objective was simple, brutal, and humiliating. Smash through the inexperienced American lines, capture their vast supply depots, and prove to the world that American forces were amateurish pretenders who couldn't stand toe-to-toe with hardened German veterans. Fredendall's defense of the sector was a tactical nightmare. He had stretched his 2nd Corps across a massive 70-mile front, with 30,000 men scattered in small, isolated groups, unable to support one another. It was a violation of the most basic military principle of concentration of force. Commanders on the ground held conflicting orders, unsure of their objectives. The defensive line was porous, riddled with gaps large enough to drive entire panzer divisions through without being challenged. When Rommel's forces struck, the impact was devastating. The American positions didn't just bend, they collapsed within hours. The scene at Kasserine was one of absolute chaos. The seasoned German panzers and infantry moved with terrifying precision, while American coordination disintegrated. Entire battalions broke and ran. Valuable equipment, tanks, artillery, trucks, was abandoned in the mud. Soldiers fled in vehicles, on foot, clinging to the sides of jeeps in complete panic, creating a traffic jam of retreat that stretched for miles. By February 22nd, the Germans had advanced 50 miles deep into American territory. The butcher's bill was staggering. American casualties exceeded 6,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Hundreds of tanks and vehicles were destroyed or left burning in the desert. It was one of the most humiliating American defeats of World War II, a black eye for a military trying to assert its global power. And where was the commander during this slaughter? Fredendall had been nowhere near the fighting. In a move that baffled and enraged his subordinates, he had established his command post in a canyon far behind the front lines by most accounts, a staggering 80 to 100 miles away from the forward positions. This wasn't just a headquarters, it was a testament to paranoia. He had employed a company of engineers for over 3 weeks, diverting them from building essential frontline defenses to blast a massive bunker complex out of solid rock, while frontline troops were digging shallow foxholes in the frozen Tunisian mud with no overhead cover. Their general was obsessed with his personal safety. While engineers were setting off dynamite to clear Fredendall's view in Speedy Valley, 30 miles away, his men were hearing a different kind of explosion. They heard the terrifying screech of German 88mm shells tearing through thin American armor. They heard the screams of the wounded and the roar of Stuka dive bombers. One man was building a fortress for himself, obsessed with maps and telephones. His soldiers were digging their own graves in the exposed desert. He rarely visited forward units, preferring to issue orders by radio and phone to commanders he had never looked in the eye. This disconnect was fatal. When Eisenhower visited on February 20th to assess the disaster, the visual evidence of the bunker combined with the stench of defeat convinced him. Fredendall had to go. Not just relieved, but removed immediately, excised like a tumor, before he could kill the host. Into this vacuum of leadership stepped George S. Patton Jr. He landed in Tunisia on March 6, 1943, like a storm front. He had been commanding in Morocco when the call came from Eisenhower with urgent, simple orders. Take command of 2nd Corps. Fix it. Do it fast. Patton arrived not as a bureaucrat, but as a warrior king. He wore polished cavalry boots, his signature ivory-handled pistols strapped to his waist, and an expression of barely controlled fury. He immediately toured every unit in the Corps, a whirlwind of energy and intimidation. He didn't hide in a bunker. He was everywhere. He fired incompetent commanders on the spot, ignoring protocol to instill immediate change. He enforced strict uniform regulations that Fredendall had ignored, fining soldiers for not wearing ties or helmets, sending a message that discipline was the foundation of survival. He visited frontline positions that Fredendall had never seen, standing in the mud with the privates. Within 2 weeks, 2nd Corps was a transformed entity. Discipline replaced chaos. Aggressive patrolling replaced defensive cowering. Pride replaced shame. The same soldiers who had run at Kasserine stood their ground, stopped German attacks, and began winning engagements. The contrast couldn't have been more obvious or more damning. These were the same units, holding the same rifles, driving the same tanks. The only variable that had changed was leadership. Patton, never one to mince words, wrote in his diary that Fredendall's command arrangements were the worst he had ever seen in his entire military career. The elaborate underground headquarters, the scattered units, the absence of any forward command presence, it wasn't just bad strategy, it was professional malpractice, it was criminal negligence. But as Patton cleaned up the mess, he noticed something else. Fredendall had already left Tunisia. He was on a plane to Algiers, and then onward to Washington. And strangely, nobody was talking about what would happen to him. The silence was deafening. Lloyd Fredendall's flight from Tunisia to Washington was a long, lonely journey that took 3 days. With refueling stops in Algiers and Morocco, he traveled alone, except for his aide, isolated in the fuselage of the transport plane. There were no ceremonies, no press interviews, no farewells, just a quiet removal from the theater of war. As the engines droned on, one can only imagine the thoughts racing through his mind. The anticipation of the end, the shame of the court-martial he felt was inevitable. The plane touched down at Bowling Field outside Washington on March 16, 1943. Fredendall stepped onto the tarmac, bracing himself. He expected to be met by grim-faced War Department officials, possibly military police, ready to escort him to an inquiry. He expected investigations, congressional hearings, and the stripping of his rank. What he got instead shocked him to his core. The air was filled not with accusations, but with music. A military band was playing a triumphant march. Reporters were waiting with flashbulbs popping. A pristine War Department staff car was idling, ready to drive him to a formal welcome ceremony. Fredendall stepped off the plane expecting the cold steel of a court-martial. Instead, he was hit by the brassy, upbeat notes of a hero's welcome. It was a surreal, disjointed moment, a sound that didn't belong to a man who had just presided over a massacre. To anyone who knew the truth of what happened in the Kasserine Pass, that music must have sounded like a funeral dirge for the concept of military accountability. The official story released to the press was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. It was carefully worded to deceive. The statement read that Major General Fredendall had returned from North Africa after distinguished service in combat. It stated he would be assuming new duties commensurate with his experience and rank. There was absolutely no mention of being fired. No reference to the route at Kasserine Pass. No explanation of why a corps commander had abandoned his command in the middle of an active campaign. The truth had been buried before Fredendall even stepped off the plane. To understand why this happened, we must look at the architect of the U.S. Army, General George C. Marshall. Marshall had performed a miracle, building the Army from a tiny force of 200,000 men in 1939 to a juggernaut of millions by 1943. He had selected the commanders, designed the training programs, and created the mobilization system. His reputation was built on competence, integrity, and accountability. But the Fredendall situation placed Marshall in an impossible bind. Within days of Fredendall's return, the narrative being pushed in Washington was extraordinary. The War Department claimed Fredendall was a combat veteran with valuable experience that couldn't be wasted. His insights, they argued, would be invaluable for training the new armies still being mobilized in the States. Reporters who tried to dig deeper, who asked about the rumors of defeat at Kasserine, were deflected. Operational details, they were told, could not be discussed for security reasons. The reality was far more complex. Fredendall's failure at Kasserine was, by extension, Marshall's failure. Marshall had picked him. Marshall had approved the training doctrine that failed. Now, the Chief of Staff faced a choice. He could court-martial Fredendall, which would mean admitting publicly that his judgment in selecting commanders had been catastrophically wrong. It would expose the Army's training flaws to the public and to the enemy. Or, he could quietly shelf Fredendall somewhere out of the way where he couldn't do more damage. Marshall chose the second option, but there was a massive complication. Fredendall wasn't just any general. He had powerful friends. Representatives and senators from his home state were already asking questions about why he had been brought home so suddenly. They wanted assurances that his service was being properly recognized. Marshall faced a political minefield. Furthermore, Eisenhower had recommended Fredendall for a promotion to lieutenant general back in November 1942, months before the Kasserine disaster. That recommendation was still sitting in the War Department, awaiting approval. Now, Marshall had to decide whether to proceed with a promotion for a general who had just been fired for gross incompetence. It was a test of the Army's integrity. Marshall decided to proceed. Fredendall would be promoted to lieutenant general and assigned to command the Second Army, a training organization based in the United States. The promotion would move forward as if Kasserine had never happened. The disaster was being erased from the personnel file. When Eisenhower heard about the decision to proceed with the promotion, he was reportedly stunned. He had just fired the man for incompetence. He had seen the broken bodies and the abandoned tanks. Now Marshall was giving him a third star? On June 1st, 1943, the charade was completed. Lloyd Fredendall was promoted to lieutenant general. The ceremony took place at the War Department with full military honors. George Marshall himself pinned on the third star. The official citation was a work of fiction, praising Fredendall's leadership in North Africa, his combat experience, and his contributions to developing American tactical doctrine. It made no mention of the thousands of casualties. It contained no hint that he had been relieved of command in disgrace less than 5 weeks earlier. Fredendall was now the same rank as George Patton, the man who had salvaged the situation in Tunisia. The man who caused the disaster wore the same 3 stars as the man who fixed it. The injustice was palpable. The promotion announcement reached Tunisia within days, carried in newspapers and mail. Officers who had served under Fredendall's failed command read the news in Times Stars and Stripes, times with disbelief and fury. Imagine the scene. A sergeant in the 1st Armored Division, sitting in the dust of a recovered camp, cleaning his weapon. He holds a greasy copy of the newspaper. He sees the face of the man who sent his friends to die from the safety of a hole in the ground. And above that man's head is a new star. That wasn't just a promotion, it was a betrayal. It was a middle finger to every man who had actually bled in the past. But the bitterest reaction came from Patton himself. He was in the midst of court-martialing officers for their failures at Kasserine. He had relieved commanders for not being aggressive enough, for not visiting frontline positions, for command arrangements that scattered forces. Fredendall had done all of these things on a massive, unforgivable scale, and his reward was a promotion. While the third star was being pinned on a clean uniform in Washington, angry letters started reaching the War Department from the dust of Tunisia. Fredendall had been assigned to command 2nd Army in Memphis, Tennessee. He would never see combat again, safely ensconced in a stateside training role. The anger in those letters was raw and unfiltered. How could the general responsible for the worst American defeat of the war be promoted while his subordinates were court-martialed? Why were the men who followed his flawed orders being destroyed while he wore 3 stars in Memphis? Marshall's response to these inquiries was always the same: a stone wall of bureaucracy. General Fredendall's record speaks for itself, he would say. His current assignment makes the best use of his experience and abilities. Personnel decisions are based on the needs of the service. What Marshall couldn't say publicly was the dark truth. Fredendall's congressional connections made firing him politically dangerous. His powerful friends in Wyoming had made it clear that any public disgrace would trigger investigations and hearings. Marshall had shielded the institution of the Army at the expense of justice. The decision established a precedent that would haunt the Army for the rest of the war. Political connections could protect incompetent generals from the consequences of their failures. The contrast with the fate of other Kasserine commanders made Fredendall's promotion even more grotesque. Take the case of Major General Orlando Ward, who commanded the 1st Armored Division under Fredendall at Kasserine. Ward was a competent officer who had protested Fredendall's orders to scatter his division across 70 miles. He had warned, explicitly, that the dispositions were indefensible. Fredendall had overruled him. When the German attack came, Ward's scattered units were defeated in detail, exactly as he had predicted. Ward fought desperately to contain the breakthrough, moving constantly between units, trying to organize a coherent defense in the chaos. After Kasserine, Patton relieved Ward in early April 1943 during the follow-up Battle of El Guetar. Patton felt Ward had become too cautious, traumatized by the disaster Fredendall's orders had created. Ward was reassigned to administrative duties as Chief of Field Artillery, though he later returned to combat with the 20th Armored Division in 1945. The relief effectively ended his wartime command trajectory at the exact moment Fredendall was being promoted. The purge of Kasserine-era officers continued even after the Army started winning under Patton. Regimental commanders who had followed Fredendall's orders were court-martialed for the failures those orders caused. Battalion commanders were relieved for not holding positions that Fredendall had made impossible to defend. These officers had no congressional protection. They had no political connections powerful enough to save them. They paid the price while Fredendall was promoted. Patton watched this unfold with profound disgust. He was a man who believed in a mystical, ancient code of the warrior. To him, Fredendall wasn't just a bad general. He was a sin against the profession of arms. Every time Patton had to salute a man like Fredendall, or see him wearing the same 3 stars, it was a reminder that even in the middle of a world-ending war, the Old Boys Club was the one thing that remained bulletproof. He told his staff that the Army was punishing the wrong people. The Corps commander who caused the disaster was safe in Tennessee wearing 3 stars. The division and regimental commanders who tried to salvage his mistakes were being destroyed. It was a lesson about military politics that Patton never forgot. Competence mattered less than connections. Taking responsibility was career suicide. Blame could be deflected downward as long as you had friends in Washington. Dwight Eisenhower watched Fredendall's promotion from his headquarters in North Africa with carefully maintained public silence. He had recommended Fredendall's relief. He had sent Patton to fix the disaster. He knew exactly how badly Fredendall had failed. But Eisenhower didn't just stay silent. He actively participated in the cover-up. He wrote to Marshall supporting the idea of giving Fredendall a hero's welcome. His reasoning was brutally political. If the American public learned a Corps commander had been fired for incompetence, it would destroy national morale. It would suggest the American war effort was being led by fools. Better to hide the failure than risk public confidence in the Army. Eisenhower never protested the promotion. He didn't write dissenting memos. He made his views known only to his immediate staff. Years later, Eisenhower's chief of staff explained why. Eisenhower was supreme Allied commander in a theater where American, British, and French forces had to work together. He couldn't afford a political war with the War Department over personnel decisions. If he challenged Marshall's handling of Fredendall, he would create enemies in Washington who could undermine his authority in the theater. So, Eisenhower made a cold calculation. He would work within the system rather than fight it. This decision would shape his command style for the rest of the war. When other generals failed, Eisenhower would relieve them quietly. reassign them to non-combat positions, and let the War Department handle the public relations. He would never again try to hold failed commanders publicly accountable. The lesson was clear. Military competence mattered less than political survival, and Eisenhower chose to survive. The real explanation for Fredendall's promotion wasn't military merit. It was congressional politics, and the smoking gun was hidden in a family tree most people had never examined. Fredendall's family had deep, historic connections to the Wyoming political machinery. His father had been a protege of Senator Francis E. Warren of Wyoming. Why does this matter? Because Warren was the father-in-law of General of the Army's John J. Pershing, the legendary commander of World War I. This family tree of military and political power made Fredendall virtually untouchable. George Marshall himself was General Pershing's former aide and protege. Marshall held Pershing in reverent awe. He could not easily move against a man whose family was so closely tied to Pershing's own father-in-law. It was a web of obligation and influence that superseded tactical reality. When word reached Washington that Fredendall might be court-martialed or publicly disgraced, those relationships activated like a dormant network. Phone calls were made to the War Department. Meetings were requested with Marshall. Questions were asked in congressional committees about whether General Fredendall was being made a scapegoat for institutional failures in training and doctrine. Marshall understood the threat immediately. Congressional investigations into North African command decisions could expose problems across the entire mobilization system. The disaster at Kasserine had many fathers, poor equipment, bad doctrine, green troops. Making Fredendall the sole scapegoat could trigger examinations that would embarrass everyone. Better to quietly promote him, assign him where he couldn't do damage, and move on. The public would never know the details. The Army would maintain its image of competence. And congressional friends would be satisfied their man was being treated fairly. It was a cynical political calculation masquerading as personnel management, and it worked perfectly. Fredendall kept his stars, his pension, and his reputation. The Army avoided congressional investigations. Marshall avoided admitting his judgment had been wrong. Everyone won except the soldiers who had died at Kasserine and the competent officers whose careers were destroyed to protect a connected man. Fredendall spent the rest of the war at 2nd Army in Memphis, overseeing the training of infantry divisions. By all accounts, he was adequate at the job. Training required administrative competence, schedules, and logistics, not split-second battlefield judgment. No scandals emerged from his headquarters, but everyone who served under him knew his real history. The third star on his shoulder was seen as political protection, not earned achievement. The cynicism this created spread through the officer corps like a virus. Men who had just survived Rommel's attacks in North Africa, who had seen the elephant, found themselves sitting in Memphis classrooms while Fredendall lectured them on modern tactics. The absurdity wasn't lost on anyone. Some officers later sarcastically credited Fredendall with teaching them valuable lessons about what times not times to do in combat. His failures at Kasserine became unofficial case studies in how not to organize defensive positions, how not to command from the rear, and how not to scatter forces. In a twisted, ironic way, Fredendall's greatest contribution to the war effort was serving as a living example of catastrophic leadership. Officers studied what he had done wrong and resolved never to repeat those mistakes. The war ended in May 1945. Fredendall remained at 2nd Army until June 1946, then retired at the rank of Lieutenant General with full honors. His official biography listed him as a distinguished combat veteran who had served his country with honor. The Kasserine disaster was mentioned only briefly in official histories, usually glossed over. Most accounts focused on Rommel's tactical skill and the inexperience of American troops, shifting the blame away from the commander. Fredendall's name appeared in footnotes, not chapters. He lived quietly in California until his death in 1963 at age 79. He never wrote memoirs. He never gave interviews about Kasserine. He never publicly addressed his relief or the promotion controversy. He took his secrets to the grave. It wasn't until later that the dam broke. Omar Bradley's 1951 memoir, *A Soldier's Story*, contained one devastating paragraph about Fredendall. Bradley wrote that Fredendall had lived in a command post blasted out of solid rock, 80 miles behind the lines, while his troops lived in foxholes, that he had commanded by telephone rather than personal presence. and that his relief was completely justified. Patton's personal wartime diaries, published after his death, were even more blunt. While Bradley estimated the bunker was 80 miles back, Patton, never one for understatements, recorded it as a full 100 miles from the men doing the dying. He called Fredendall a moral coward who sent men to die while building himself that bunker. He called the promotion a disgrace to the service. His official reports at the time had been far more restrained to maintain military decorum, but his private thoughts revealed the depth of his contempt. Eisenhower's memoirs were more diplomatic but equally damning in their implication. He wrote that Fredendall's relief was necessary for the good of the service, and that the decision was one of the most clear-cut of the war. But none of these accounts changed the fact that Fredendall had retired as a 3-star general with a comfortable pension, while better officers had been destroyed for lesser failures. The system had worked for him. In the late 1950s, George Marshall was interviewed by his official biographer, Forrest Pogue, about his wartime decisions. They asked him specifically about the Fredendall promotion. Marshall's answer was revealing in its defensiveness. Marshall defended the decision on institutional grounds. Destroying Fredendall publicly, he argued, would have required court-martial proceedings that would have exposed how unprepared American forces were in early 1943. The troops were green. The doctrine was untested. The training had failed against German veterans. Even Rommel had noted this in his own papers. Promoting Fredendall into a training role masked the fact that the entire system had been unprepared. It protected the institution's reputation while removing him from combat. Marshall never said he regretted the decision, but the defensive tone suggested he knew the moral cost of what he had done. The consequences of this compromise echoed through the rest of the war, establishing a system where failure could be survived with political protection. It taught a generation of ambitious officers that cultivating congressional relationships mattered as much as tactical skill. It created a cynical environment where failure led to promotion, while success was optional, where political connections mattered more than dead soldiers, where the system protected the guilty and punished the innocent. The soldiers were the ones who paid the price. At Kasserine Pass, over 6,000 Americans became casualties because of Fredendall's incompetence. They died in the mud, confused and abandoned. After the war, those casualties' families learned that the general responsible had been promoted while their sons were buried in North Africa. We often talk about political face-saving as if it's a victimless crime, a necessary lubricant for the gears of government. But every star on Fredendall's shoulder was paid for, in agonizing installments, by families in Wyoming, Illinois, and New York who were receiving telegrams that didn't offer promotions. They offered only a folded flag and a hollow thank you. In Washington, they saved a career. In North Africa, they simply filled a cemetery. The man responsible for the disaster at Kasserine Pass retired with full honors, a 3-star general's pension, and a reputation protected by the most powerful men in the army. He lived out his days in comfort, shielded by the silence of his peers. History is written by the winners, but sometimes it is also edited by the people too embarrassed to admit they picked the wrong man. Because in war, competence is negotiable, but connections are